The year was 1883. The wind bit raw across the prairie, carrying the scent of dust and distance, a constant reminder of how far the town of Redemption was from anywhere that mattered. Clara Shaw knew distance well. She carried miles of it inside her, a landscape of loss measured in quiet years spent serving whiskey and smiles that didn't reach her eyes. She worked at the Lucky Star, the kind of place polite folk hurried past with averted gazes. It wasn't the worst life, not by a long shot, but it was a lonely one. Every laugh she feigned, every weary step across the sawdust floor, was a grain added to the mountain of isolation that had grown around her since everything that mattered had been taken. Grief was a physical weight in the airless room she called home above the saloon, heavy and constant. Her hands, usually steady pouring drinks, trembled slightly as she read the letter again. It had arrived 2 days ago, tucked into the sparse mail delivery by a circuit rider passing through. A distant relative she barely remembered, a great-aunt Agnes, had passed in Philadelphia. A small inheritance was hers, enough to perhaps buy a small piece of land, maybe even a proper little house somewhere far from Redemption. Enough to start over. But there was a condition. Aunt Agnes, bless her prudish soul, had stipulated that the beneficiary must be of good standing and, most importantly, married. Clara almost laughed, a dry, bitter sound that would curdle the milk in a cow. A saloon girl, married and of good standing in the eyes of a Philadelphia spinster? It was a cruel joke from the grave. She had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to become respectable. 2 weeks to acquire a husband. The lawyer's letter was precise, formal, leaving no room for interpretation. A marriage certificate, witnessed and verified, must be presented to his representative in the nearby town of Haven City by the 1st of the next month. 2 weeks. Impossible. She'd been nursing the problem like a toothache for 48 hours, the desperation a cold knot in her stomach. Marry? Who? The roughnecks who frequented the saloon wanted a temporary convenience, not a wife. The few decent men in town wouldn't look twice at a woman like her, even if she cleaned herself up and wore a bonnet. Their wives saw to that, their stares sharper than broken glass. Then she thought of him, Garrett Vance. He wasn't a regular, but he wasn't a stranger either. A cowboy, mostly kept to himself. Rode in maybe once every few months for supplies, stayed quiet, drank his whiskey slow and straight. Paid for his drinks and left. He had a place somewhere out beyond the dusty mesas, a small ranch or maybe just a claim. He had the look of a man who preferred his own company, someone who had learned to live with silence. He also looked like a man who might need $5. $5 was a small fortune to Clara, hard-earned coin squirreled away against true emergencies. This qualified. She saw him later that day, sitting alone at a table near the back, the lamplight catching the worn leather of his vest. He was tall, lean, with eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. A strong face, etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and something else, something closed off. He had a quiet kind of capability about him. He wouldn't be easily rattled. That was important. Taking a deep breath, she walked over, her smile feeling stiffer than usual. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice pitched low so only he could hear over the saloon din. He looked up, his expression unreadable, acknowledging her presence with a slight dip of his head. "Mr. Shaw." She pulled up a chair without asking, a bold move for her. The noise of the saloon suddenly seemed distant, muffled. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About a business proposition." One eyebrow rose fractionally. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, waiting. He didn't seem surprised, just patient, as if life had taught him to expect the unexpected, but not to rush to meet it. "I need a husband," she blurted out, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. His hand stopped mid-air with the glass. He set it down carefully. His eyes, gray like a stormy sky, finally showed a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, but mostly caution. "A husband," he repeated flatly. It wasn't a question. "For 2 weeks," she clarified quickly, leaning closer. "Just on paper. A name. We'd get married proper, in front of a preacher. I'd get the certificate. You'd come out to your place, stay there like you always do. I'd handle everything here. After 2 weeks, after I've shown the certificate in Haven City, we can get it annulled. Or you can just ride away, whatever you want, no fuss. No wifely duties." She felt a hot flush creep up her neck, but met his gaze steadily. She needed him to understand this was strictly a transaction. He studied her face, his gaze probing, assessing. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually looked at her in the saloon, with hunger or dismissal. He looked like he was measuring the truth of her words. "Why?" he asked eventually. His voice was low, a rumble in his chest. She hesitated, then decided honesty was the quickest path. An inheritance, small one, left by an aunt, but she put a condition on it. Must be married, must be respectable. She almost choked on the last word. He was quiet for a long moment, the sounds of the saloon washing over them. A piano clanked, a drunken man bellowed a song, boots scuffed on the floor. He seemed miles away, considering the proposition not just for its strangeness, but for its implications. $5, she added, pushing a small tied bundle of coins across the table towards him. $5 for your time, and your silence. It was almost everything she had. He looked at the money, then back at her. His eyes held no greed. They held something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe the tired recognition of another soul cornered by circumstance. He didn't touch the money. "Why me?" "You keep to yourself," she said simply. "You don't ask questions. You look like you can handle things." "Like you can handle me," she didn't add, but he seemed to understand. "And," she added, taking another gamble, "you look like you might need it." He finally reached for the money, picked up the bundle, weighed it in his hand. His gaze lingered on her face. There was a faint sadness around his eyes, a kind of weariness that mirrored her own, though of a different sort. $5, he said, as if testing the sum. "For 2 weeks of being married." "Just on paper," she confirmed, her breath held tight in her chest. He was silent again, the tension stretched, thin and taut. She watched his face, trying to read something, anything in his still features. His hand closed around the money. "All right, Mr. Shaw," he said slowly, nodding once. $5. You got yourself a husband." Relief washed over her so suddenly it made her feel lightheaded. "Clara," she said, the name feeling foreign on her tongue in this context. "My name is Clara." He met her gaze directly then, and for the first time, a hint of a smile touched his lips, a faint, almost imperceptible curve that softened his stern face. "Garrett," he replied. "Garrett Vance." Getting married wasn't easy, even for $5 and convenience. The preacher in Redemption was a rheumy-eyed man who preached fire and brimstone and eyed Clara with suspicion. He needed convincing, mostly with another dollar, and a story Clara spun about needing a respectable name before traveling east to care for a sick relative. Garrett stood beside her, silent and still, a solid presence that somehow lent credibility to the flimsy tale. He wore a clean, if worn, shirt and his best hat, looking less like a cowboy and more like a man who had simply chosen a hard life. The words were spoken, the certificate signed, Mr. and Mrs. Garrett Vance. It felt absurd, a play they were performing under dusty lamplight. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt a peculiar lurch in her chest, a phantom echo of a feeling she thought she'd buried long ago. Garrett didn't touch her, didn't offer a congratulatory smile. He simply nodded to the preacher, paid the fee Clara had given him, and turned to leave. "My place is about a half-day's ride north," he said to her outside the small chapel, the prairie wind whipping at their clothes. "Dusty, one-room cabin, not much." She blinked, momentarily confused. "Your place?" "I told you, you can just go back. I don't need you there. This was just for the paper." He turned back to her, his expression serious. "We're married, Mr. Vance, for 2 weeks. Folks talk in towns like these. If you stay here, cleaning spittoons and pouring drinks, and I vanish back to the prairie, it won't look right, not for your respectability. Best if you come out to the cabin. For the 2 weeks. Looks proper. Folks see you leave with your new husband." She hadn't considered that, of course. The performance had to extend beyond the signing of the paper. It had to look real. The thought of leaving Redemption, even for a short time, was both terrifying and exhilarating. Leaving the Lucky Star meant leaving the only life she'd known for years. "All right," she said, the word a small puff of white in the cold air. "All right, I'll get my things." Her things weren't much. A worn carpet bag held a few dresses, a spare pair of boots, a shawl, a brush, and the precious letter. She left the room above the saloon with no regrets, no goodbyes. The lucky star had been a cage, albeit one she'd grown accustomed to. They rode out the next morning, the sky bruised with pre-dawn color. Clara rode side saddle on a borrowed mare, feeling stiff and awkward. Garrett rode beside her on a sturdy bay, silent as always, but his presence was somehow comforting. He set a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was keeping up. The land opened up around them, vast and empty under the immense sky. Rolling hills gave way to flatter plains, dotted with sagebrush and sparse grasses. The wind was a constant companion, pressing against them, whispering through the dry stalks. It was a lonely, beautiful kind of place. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat the meager lunch Clara had packed: hardtack, jerky, and a couple of bruised apples. They ate in silence, sitting a polite distance apart. The silence between them wasn't awkward, not exactly. It was more like a shared space, comfortable in its lack of demand. Clara found herself studying Garrett when he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, constantly alert. "How long you been out here?" she asked eventually, needing to break the quiet. He chewed slowly, swallowed. "Long enough," he replied. It wasn't evasive, just complete. Long enough to know the land, long enough to want for nothing but what he could provide himself. "Lonely?" she ventured. He considered the question, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Less lonely than being around folks who make you feel like you don't belong," he said finally. His words landed softly but hit hard. She knew exactly what he meant. The saloon, the town, polite society, they all had a way of making you feel like an alien in your own skin. "I understand," she said, her voice low. He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. A brief, shared moment of understanding passed between them, a tiny crack in the walls they both kept around themselves. The cabin was small, just as he'd said, made of rough-hewn logs, perched on a slight rise overlooking a dry creek bed. It had a single window, a stone fireplace, a rough table, and a narrow cot. There was a lean-to attached for the horses. It was Spartan, but clean, and blessedly silent, save for the wind. "It's nice," she said, perhaps a little too brightly, trying to fill the sudden quiet of arrival. "It's home," Garrett said. The way he said it, quiet and firm, gave the simple cabin a dignity it wouldn't otherwise possess. He showed her where the water bucket was kept, the small supply of firewood, the shelf with their meager food stores, beans, flour, salt pork. There was only the one cot. "I'll take the floor," he said, seeing her glance at the cot. "Used to it?" "No," she said quickly. "It's your home. I can take the floor. I'm used to." She stopped herself. "Used to worse." "Miss Garrett Vance," he said, using the formal address again, though it felt different now, less like a title, more like a quiet acknowledgement. "You are my temporary wife. The cot is yours." End of discussion. They settled into a strange routine. Clara tried to make herself useful, sweeping the dirt floor, washing the few dishes in cold water, trying to stretch their provisions. Garrett spent his days doing ranch work, checking on the few head of cattle he had, mending fences, chopping wood. They worked separately but shared the small space in the evenings. Meals were the most awkward. They ate at the table, the silence often stretching long. Clara would watch him from the corner of her eye. He ate with a quiet efficiency, never wasting a bite. His hands were calloused and strong, the hands of a working man. One evening, a few days in, a question slipped out of her before she could stop it. "Why did you agree to this, Garrett? $5 isn't much for 2 weeks of your life." He paused, knife halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said slowly. $5 was enough. Or maybe I was curious." Curious? About her? The idea seemed outlandish. Curious about what? "About why a woman like you," he gestured vaguely, encompassing her and the life she'd left behind, "needed something like this so bad." He didn't say it judgmentally, just as a simple observation. She felt the familiar defenses rise, but something about his calm gaze made her hesitant to deploy them. She had nothing to lose with him. He knew who she was, where she'd come from. What was there left to hide? "My ma died when I was 16, she began, her voice low. "Pa," he drank, Drank himself into an early grave a few years later, left me nothing but debt. My options were limited. She didn't mention the baby, the one she'd lost. Not yet. That was a pain too deep to share casually. The saloon was survival. He listened without interruption, his eyes steady on hers. When she finished, he simply nodded. He didn't offer platitudes or pity, just understanding. Survival, he repeated, as if testing the word. Lots of ways to survive out here. Not many for a woman alone, she said. It was a simple truth. No, he agreed quietly, not many. In the confined space of the cabin, the initial awkwardness began to soften. They learned each other's rhythms. Garrett was an early riser, quiet as a shadow as he made coffee over the fire. Clara slept late, the deep, dreamless sleep of exhaustion finally catching up with her after years of broken rest in the noisy saloon. He left wood and water ready for her before he went out. She tried her hand at baking biscuits, most turning out hard as rocks, but he ate them without complaint, sometimes even offering a quiet word of encouragement. They talked more, the conversation sparse but revealing. He spoke of the land, the weather, the animals. She spoke of the few good things she remembered from her childhood before it all went wrong. They carefully skirted anything too personal, anything that might breach the transactional boundary they'd established. Yet the boundary was subtly shifting, blurring at the edges. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the small cabin. Rain hammered against the roof, the wind howled like a grieving thing, and lightning lit the interior with blinding flashes, followed seconds later by deafening cracks of thunder. Clara, despite herself, flinched at each loud boom. She hadn't realized how on edge she'd been for so long, how the constant threat of danger in the saloon had frayed her nerves. Garrett was sitting by the fire cleaning his rifle. He paused, watching her. He didn't comment, didn't coddle. After a particularly violent peal of thunder, he simply said, "Loud, isn't it?" She managed a weak smile. "Makes you feel small." "Or reminds you you're still here," he said, his gaze steady. He went back to his rifle cleaning, but a few minutes later, he shifted slightly, making room for her beside the fire. It wasn't an invitation, not in words, but she understood. She moved closer, drawing her knees up to her chest, letting the warmth of the fire soak into her. His quiet presence was a solid anchor against the storm's fury. They sat in silence, side by side, watching the firelight flicker. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had settled. It was the first time Clara hadn't felt utterly alone during a storm in years. Days bled into a week. The thought of Haven City and the lawyer's representative loomed. She needed to get the certificate validated soon. But leaving the quiet safety of the cabin, leaving Garrett's understated presence, felt unexpectedly daunting. She was sweeping the porch one afternoon when she saw him ride in, a bit earlier than usual. He dismounted, his movements stiff. As he turned, she saw he was clutching his arm, blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. "Garrett," she cried, dropping the broom and rushing to him. "Just a scratch," he said, wincing. "Caught it on some barbed wire fixing a fence." It was more than a scratch. A deep, jagged tear. He was pale under his tan. She helped him inside, her mind going practical. "Water, clean cloth." "Sit down," she ordered, her voice surprisingly firm. He obeyed, sinking onto the cot. She fetched water from the bucket, tore strips from a clean old chemise. Working quickly, she cut away the sleeve, revealing the wound. It was bleeding freely. "Hold pressure on it," she instructed, pressing a cloth into his hand and guiding it to the cut. "I need to clean this out properly." She heated water, found a small bottle of antiseptic, something he kept tucked away. It wasn't much, but it was something. As she worked, carefully cleaning the wound, her hands gentle despite the urgency, she felt his gaze on her. It wasn't just the stoic patience she was used to. There was a flicker of vulnerability there. "You're good at this," he murmured, his voice rough with pain. "Did it enough in the saloon," she said, focusing on her task. "Stitches, patching up knife fights, you learn fast." He was silent for a moment. "Not the same," he said. "This is different." She finished cleaning, applied more antiseptic, and began to bandage it tightly. Her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and rough. A simple touch, but it sent a surprising jolt through her. They had shared a small cabin, shared meals, shared silence, but this was the first time they had touched, not out of necessity like helping him dismount, but with intimacy, born of care. "Keep it clean," she said, tying off the bandage. "And try not to use that arm too much. You need rest." He looked at his bandaged arm, then back at her. His gaze was soft, grateful. It was a look she hadn't seen directed at her in years. "Thank you, Clara," he said, using her name without the formal mystera for the first time since that night in the saloon. "Just trying to earn my keep," she mumbled, turning away to put the things away, her heart beating a little faster than it should have. His injury meant he couldn't do much ranch work. He was confined to the cabin, restless and quiet. Clara took on more of the chores outside, chopping kindling, feeding the chickens he kept, fetching water. She didn't mind the work. It felt good to be doing something useful, something that wasn't pretending or serving. They spent more time together in the cabin, talking, or simply being in each other's company. He told her about the land, about the wildflowers that would bloom in the spring, the different kinds of birds that passed through. He spoke of the challenges of ranching, the unpredictability of weather, the constant battle against nature's indifference. She told him about her family, about her ma's laugh, the smell of her pa's pipe tobacco before he became a different man. She even found herself talking about the baby she'd lost, born too early, too weak, in a back room of the saloon, unwanted and unmourned by everyone but her. The words were difficult, painful to unearth, but saying them aloud to Garrett, seeing the quiet sympathy in his eyes, somehow lessened the burden. "He would have been 6 this year," she whispered, tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. Garrett reached out, slowly, hesitantly, and covered her hand with his good one. His touch was warm, solid. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "That's a heavy thing to carry alone." It was the most intimate they had been, this shared acknowledgement of deep sorrow. In that moment, the $5, the fake marriage, the inheritance, it all faded into the background. They were just two people, alone in the world, finding a sliver of understanding in each other's presence. The second week was drawing to a close. Garrett's arm was healing, though still stiff. The trip to Haven City was imminent. The thought of returning to Redemption felt like stepping back into a suffocating box. The quiet cabin, the vast sky, Garrett's steady company. It felt more like home than anywhere she'd been in years. One evening as they sat by the fire, the silence between them different now, comfortable, even companionable, Garrett spoke, his voice low and serious. "Clara," he began, "there's something you should know, about me." Her heart gave a little lurch. This was it, his secret. She had wondered about it, seen the guardedness in his eyes, the way he scanned his surroundings constantly. "What is it, Garrett?" He took a deep breath. "I'm not just a cowboy. Or, I wasn't, not always." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I used to be a lawman, up north, in Montana." A lawman? The revelation was unexpected. It fit, though, the quiet watchfulness, the capable hands, the underlying sense of contained strength. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Got caught up in something," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "A shipment of gold went missing, 2 men dead." He paused again, the silence heavy. "They said I did it," he continued, his voice flat. "Said I killed them, took the gold, framed me." Clara stared at him, shock momentarily overriding everything else. "Framed? By who?" "Men who wanted the gold," he said simply. "Men with influence. They made it look good, real good. By the time I figured out what was happening, who was behind it, there was no proving my innocence. Not with the evidence they'd planted. My badge meant nothing." "So you ran," she whispered. He nodded. "Had to. They weren't just after the gold anymore. They were after me. To make sure I stayed quiet. Figured I'd vanish down here, start over, keep my head down." "Do they know where you are?" The question was immediate, born of fear. Not just for him, but for herself. Their connection, however temporary it was supposed to be, suddenly felt perilous. "Don't think so," he said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Been careful, different name down here, keep to myself. Haven't used the skills I learned back then." His secret. It wasn't just a hidden past, it was a lurking danger. It explained the isolation, the guardedness, the almost instinctual caution. It also explained why a seemingly capable man might agree to a strange proposition for a pittance. He wasn't looking for connection or notoriety, just quiet anonymity. You risked being found by marrying me," she said, the weight of it settling in her chest. "Needed to look respectable," he said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "Harder to be a wanted man if you got a wife." The humor fell flat. The danger felt suddenly very real. A third presence in the small cabin. Garrett Vance, the quiet cowboy, was a man on the run, potentially hunted. And she had tied herself to him. "Are they still looking?" "Don't know," he admitted. "Might be. Folks with that much to lose, they don't give up easy." A cold dread curled in her stomach. She had sought safety, respectability, a new start. She had found danger. But looking at Garrett's face, etched with weariness and a familiar kind of aloneness, she didn't feel fear of him. She felt a surge of something protective. He wasn't a criminal. He was a victim, cornered just like she had been, trying to survive. "We should go to Haven City tomorrow," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "Get the paper done. Then, you can go. Ride somewhere else, further away." He looked at her, really looked at her. "And you?" "I'll figure something out," she said, though the thought of being alone again with this new knowledge made her heart ache. "Running doesn't always solve things, Clara," he said quietly. "Staying didn't either," she retorted, thinking of her life in redemption. The next morning the sky was clear, bright blue and innocent. They rode towards Haven City, the silence between them different now, tinged with the unspoken threat. Clara held the inheritance letter tight in her pocket. It suddenly felt less like a key to freedom and more like a flimsy piece of paper that had inadvertently led her into a different kind of confinement. Haven City was larger than Redemption, bustling with a few more shops, a proper hotel, and a stone courthouse. They went directly to the lawyer's office, a respectable building on the main street. Inside, it smelled of ink and old paper. Mr. Harrison, the lawyer's representative, was a portly man with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes. He looked at Clara, then at Garrett, his gaze lingering slightly on the cowboy's rugged appearance. He clearly wasn't what Mistera Agnes had envisioned for her beneficiary's husband. Clara presented the letter and the marriage certificate. She explained, calmly and concisely, that she was Mistera Garrett Vance, newly married, and wished to finalize the inheritance. Garrett stood beside her, quiet and imposing, his injured arm held stiffly. Mr. Harrison examined the documents, peered at them over his spectacles. "Vance, you say," he murmured, tapping a finger on the marriage certificate. "Garrett Vance." Clara's stomach tightened. Was the name recognizable? Was it uncommon? Mr. Harrison looked up, fixing his sharp gaze on Garrett. "Vance, Vance," he stroked his beard. "Seems I heard that name recently. Gentleman asking around. Tall, quiet fellow," they said, keeping to himself. Clara's blood ran cold. They were close. Maybe in this very town. Garrett's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but his face remained impassive. "Plenty of Vances out this way, Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice low and steady. "Common name." Perhaps, Mr. Harrison said, though his eyes remained speculative. These gentlemen were quite insistent. Offered a reward for information. A reward. They weren't just looking anymore. They were actively hunting. "Well," Mr. Harrison continued, setting the certificate down. "The paperwork seems in order. I'll need to send verification to Philadelphia, of course. It will take some time. A few weeks. Once I receive confirmation, the funds can be released." He smiled, a tight, professional expression. "Congratulations, Mistera Vance, and to you, Mr. Vance. A most unexpected union." Unexpected. The word hung in the air, charged with double meaning. Clara managed a strained smile. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison." They left the office, the sunshine outside feeling too bright, too revealing. The street, previously just a busy thoroughfare, now seemed full of potential threats. Every stranger was a possible danger. "They're here," Clara whispered, keeping her voice low as they walked. Garrett nodded, his gaze sweeping the street. "Closer than I thought." "What do we do?" The $5, the inheritance, it all felt irrelevant now. Their safety was the only thing that mattered. "Can't go back to the cabin," Garrett said. "Too easy to find if they know my name and that I'm married. And they likely know I ride alone, live alone. A wife would be unusual. Draw attention. My things are still there, Clara said, then dismissed it. Belongings didn't matter. We need to get out of town, Garrett said. Now, before they spot us. They retrieved their horses from the livery, their movements calm, deliberate, giving no outward sign of the panic rising inside them. Clara glanced around nervously, searching every face. As they reached the edge of town, turning their horses north towards the open prairie, Garrett suddenly reined in. Smoke, he said, pointing to a thin column rising in the distance, far to the north. Too far to be a cooking fire, too close to be coincidence. That's roughly the direction of my place. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara. If those men had found his cabin, what would they do? Would they assume he was there? Wait for him? Burn it down out of spite? We need to go back, Clara said, surprising herself. Garrett looked at her, his eyes questioning. Clara, if that's them, going back is walking into a trap. But, your home, your things. She didn't just mean possessions, she meant the quiet life he had built, the only place he had felt safe. He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. It's too risky. The cabin's just logs. It can be rebuilt. Our lives can't. But if they think you're there, she pressed. Maybe we can circle around, see who it is. If it's them, lead them away. It was a wild, reckless thought, born of instinct, not logic. She couldn't stand the idea of them destroying the small piece of peace he had found. He studied her face, seeing the determination there. Seeing perhaps that the passive saloon girl he'd hired was gone, replaced by a woman who had faced hardship and knew how to fight for what little she had. It's a bad idea, Clara, he said, but his tone had softened. Maybe, she admitted, but I can't just ride away. After years of running, she finally felt a flicker of something worth standing for. This quiet, stoic man who had offered her temporary shelter, who had listened to her grief, who was now in danger partly because of her need for respectability. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping the horizon, calculating the risks. Finally, he nodded. All right. We go quiet. Stay low, circle wide. They turned the horses, riding off the trail, keeping to the folds of the land. The tension was palpable, a live thing riding between them. Every rustle of grass, every distant bird call seemed amplified, a potential warning. As they drew closer, circling to approach the cabin from the west, the smell of smoke grew stronger, acrid. They dismounted a few hundred yards away, tying the horses in a small copse of trees. Crouching low, they crept forward on foot, using the sparse cover of sagebrush and rocks. From their vantage point on a low ridge, they saw the cabin. Or what was left of it. It was engulfed in flames, the roof collapsing inwards. 3 figures were visible nearby, silhouetted against the inferno. They weren't random travelers, they were searching the area, kicking through what wasn't yet burning. Them, Garrett breathed, his hand instinctively going to the pistol tucked in his waistband. 2 of Thorne's men, and Thorne himself. The name was venomous on his tongue. Thorne, the man who had framed him. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, 3 of them, armed, searching, and they knew he was married. They must have seen us in town, Garrett murmured, his eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. Followed us, saw us head this way, figured I'd come back here. The men finished their search of the immediate area around the burning cabin, seemingly satisfied that Garrett wasn't inside or hiding nearby. One of them gestured towards the south, the direction back towards Redemption and Haven City. They were planning to cut them off. They'll try to head us off, Garrett said, confirming her fear. Probably figure we'll make for town. What do we do? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. We double back, Garrett said, pulling her close, his voice urgent and low in her ear. Head north into the hills. It's rougher terrain, harder to follow. Might lose them. They retreated as silently as they had come, reaching their horses. Mounting quickly, they turned not towards the easy path back the way they came, but north, towards the unforgiving landscape of the low hills. The land was indeed rough, rocky outcrops, steep gullies, thick stands of prickly pear. The horses struggled, picking their way carefully. They rode hard, pushing the animals, the plumes of smoke from the burning cabin, a dark smudge against the horizon behind them, a constant reminder of what they were running from. They heard the shouts eventually, faint at first, carried on the wind, then growing louder. The men had realized they hadn't headed back towards town. They were following. Garrett pushed the pace, guiding them through narrow canyons and up rocky slopes, trying to use the terrain to their advantage. Clara, despite her inexperience, rode with a fierce determination, clinging to the mare's back, trusting Garrett implicitly. The fear was still there, a cold knot, but it was mixed with a strange sense of purpose. She wasn't running aimlessly anymore. She was running with someone, for someone. They rode for what felt like hours, the sun beginning its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues. The horses were tiring. They had to stop. They found a narrow overhang and a rocky bluff, hidden from view from below. They dismounted, the horses blowing hard. "They'll be gaining on us," Garrett said, scanning their back trail. "Hard riding in this country. Their horses will be tiring too, but they'll keep coming." Clara slumped against the rock face, exhaustion making her limbs heavy. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving her shaky. "Why are they so determined?" she asked. "After all this time?" "Maybe they heard I got married," Garrett speculated grimly. "Figured I was settling down, easier to find a man with roots, or maybe Thorn just can't stand the idea that I'm still alive. A loose end. A loose end, that's what he was to them. And now, she was a loose end too, simply by being with him." They spent the rest of the evening huddled under the overhang as the temperature dropped, sharing the last of the hardtack. Garrett stayed watchful, listening to the sounds of the night, his hand resting on his pistol. Clara tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence of the prairie, usually a comfort, now felt menacing, full of unseen threats. Just before dawn, Garrett's hand clamped over her arm, waking her instantly. "Horses," he whispered, "they're close." They crept to the edge of the overhang, peering down into the pre-dawn gloom. 3 riders were making their way slowly along the gully below, their horses exhausted. Thorn and his men. "They're heading right for us," Clara breathed, her heart leaping into her throat. "They'll have to come up this slope," Garrett murmured, assessing the approach. "Only one way up this side." He drew his pistol. His injured arm was still stiff, but he held the weapon steadily in his good hand. "Garrett," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "3 of them." "I know," he said, his gaze hard. "Stay back, Clara. Stay out of sight." He positioned himself near the edge of the overhang, hidden by rocks, waiting. Clara crouched low, her breath held tight, watching the figures below grow closer. She couldn't just hide. She wouldn't. As the first rider started up the narrow path leading to their position, Garrett called out, "That's far enough, Thorn." The riders froze. Thorn, recognizable even in the dim light, pulled up his horse. "Vance," he bellowed, "figured you'd make it this far." "You burned my cabin, Thorn." Garrett's voice was calm, dangerously so. "Loose ends, Vance," Thorn shouted back. "You should have stayed gone." "Didn't like running anymore," Garrett replied. "Send the woman out, Vance," Thorn ordered. "This ain't her fight." "She's my wife," Garrett said, his voice unwavering. "She's staying with me." Clara felt a fierce wave wash over her. His wife. He claimed her. In the face of danger, he didn't push her away. Gunfire erupted. Garrett fired, forcing the riders to scatter, seeking cover. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around the overhang. Thorn and his men dismounted, beginning to move up the slope on foot, taking cover behind rocks and sparse brush. Garrett fired sparingly, making each shot count. He was a good shot, steady and accurate, despite his arm. But there were 3 of them, and they were advancing. Clara saw one of Thorn's men trying to flank their position, moving silently along a different path she'd spotted earlier. Instinct took over. There were loose rocks near the edge of the overhang. Heavy ones. Without a word, she scrambled forward, ignoring Garrett's quiet command to stay back. Using all her strength, she shoved a large boulder over the edge, sending it crashing down the slope. It bounced, gathered speed, and slammed into the man trying to flank them. He cried out, a sharp sound cut short as he went tumbling down the rocky incline. 2 left. Garrett glanced back, startled, then met her eyes. A look of fierce pride, quickly masked, crossed his face. Thorn and his remaining man pressed their attack. Garrett fired again, hitting something with a clang, a rifle perhaps. The man Thorn was with yelled in frustration. Thorn himself was agile, using the rocks for cover, advancing steadily towards their position. Garrett was focused on him, anticipating his moves. Clara saw the third man, the one whose rifle Garrett had hit, draw a pistol. He wasn't wounded, just disarmed. He was working his way up the slope, closer, while Thorne drew Garrett's fire. There was no time to warn Garrett. Clara looked around wildly for a weapon. Nothing, just rocks. She grabbed the largest one she could lift, her arms screaming with the effort. As the man cleared the last bit of cover and lunged towards the overhang, pistol raised, Clara threw the rock. It wasn't accurate, wasn't powerful, but it was enough. It hit his arm, throwing off his aim. His shot went wide, whining off the rock face. Garrett reacted instantly, turning and firing a single shot. The man staggered back, clutched his chest and fell. Only Thorne remained. He had seen his men fall. He let out a roar of rage and charged the overhang, firing wildly. Garrett fired back. Thorne stumbled, hit, but kept coming, driven by pure fury. Garrett fired again. This time, Thorne stopped, swaying. He raised his pistol one last time, aiming directly at Clara. "No!" Garrett yelled, lunging forward despite his injured arm, shielding Clara with his body. A shot rang out. Clara cried out, pushing Garrett back, seeing him wince in pain. But the shot hadn't hit him. It had hit Thorne, who now crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling from his grasp. Sitting on the ridge behind them, silhouetted against the rising sun, was a solitary figure on horseback. An Indian man, his face impassive. He lowered the rifle he held. It was Wapasha, a Lakota man Garrett knew from trading, a man who sometimes camped in these hills. He had clearly seen the smoke and the confrontation and chosen a side. Silence fell, heavy and complete, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the distant crackling of the burning cabin. Thorne and his men were dead or incapacitated below. The immediate threat was gone. Garrett turned to Clara, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock and something else, something profound. "Clara," he breathed, reaching for her, his good hand gently cupping her face. "You saved us." Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of fear, relief, and the overwhelming intensity of the moment. She hadn't been the helpless saloon girl. She had fought. She had protected him. "You protected me too," she whispered back, leaning into his touch. Wapasha rode closer, surveyed the scene below with a stoic gaze, then looked at Garrett. He nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, then turned his horse and rode away as silently as he had appeared. A debt repaid, perhaps, or simply a choice made on a lonely prairie morning. They stayed under the overhang for a long time, watching the sun rise, waiting until they were sure no one else was coming. Garrett rebandaged his arm, wincing with the effort. Clara tended to the horses, giving them water from their canteens, murmuring soothing words. When they finally rode back down the slope, leaving the dead behind, the world felt different. Smaller, somehow, and more real. The vastness of the prairie no longer felt lonely, but simply space for them. They rode towards Haven City again, but this time, the journey was different. The silence between them was no longer guarded, but comfortable. They rode closer together, their horses walking side by side. When they reached Mr. Harrison's office, they were different people than the awkward pair who had presented the marriage certificate days before. They stood taller, held themselves with a quiet confidence born of shared danger and mutual reliance. Mr. Harrison, busy with papers, looked up, surprised to see them back so soon. He noted the grime, the weariness in their faces, the bandage on Garrett's arm. He didn't ask questions. He was a lawyer. His business was paperwork and money, not the rough and tumble lives that brought people into his office. Clara simply confirmed they still wanted to proceed. Mr. Harrison nodded, promised to send the verification. The inheritance would come eventually. It didn't seem quite so crucial now. They didn't go back to Redemption. There was nothing for Clara there anymore. The lucky star felt like a lifetime away. They rode north again, back towards the land where Garrett's cabin had stood. They would rebuild. It would be hard work, starting over again. But this time, they wouldn't be starting alone. They found a spot near the burned cabin, where the fire hadn't touched the trees. They made a temporary camp. As they sat by the fire that night, under a sky teeming with stars, Clara leaned her head on Garrett's good shoulder. "Your secret," she said softly. "Being a lawman, being framed. Not much of a secret anymore, he said, his arms circling her, pulling her close. It doesn't change anything, she said, meaning between them. I know, he murmured, pressing a kiss into her hair. My turn for a question. The inheritance. Was it enough to buy a place? Maybe, she said. Enough to start, enough for materials, maybe a few head of cattle. Good, he said. We'll build it together. We? He held her tighter. We, Clara. This wasn't just for $5 anymore, or a piece of paper. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark prairie. I was alone out here, running, didn't think I'd ever stop, didn't think I'd ever want to. He turned his head, his eyes searching hers in the firelight. You came along, brought noise and questions and life. You didn't judge. You helped. You fought. You're not just a wife on paper, Clara. Not to me. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. He saw her. Not the saloon girl, not the grieving woman, but her. Stronger than she thought, capable of love and fierceness. You aren't just a name, Garrett, she said, her voice thick. You're home, the closest thing to it I've had in years. He held her close, his embrace strong and steady. The wind still blew across the prairie, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like freedom. They had both been running from ghosts, hiding from the world, carrying the weight of their pasts. In a strange $5 bargain, they had found each other. And in finding each other, they had found the resilience to stop running, to turn and face the future, together. The quiet cowboy and the desperate saloon girl, they were Mr. and Mistera Garrett Vance. And the paper didn't make it real, they did.